So good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, I'm thrilled to welcome you to Absolutely Interdisciplinary 2024. Maybe we could do a little round of applause for that to get us in the mood for the session. My name is Kelly Lyons, and I'm currently serving as the interim director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Information, and I have a cross appointment in the Department of Computer Science. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, to work, and to come together on this land. Over the next 2 days, we've convened an exciting series of sessions with leading thinkers from across computer science, engineering, law, philosophy, economics, public policy, and many more. Together, we'll think about challenges presented by artificial intelligence and tackle key questions that will inform future research directions, future research agendas, and to help ensure that advanced technologies are designed in ways that benefit all of society. These are exciting and important challenges, and I'm very much looking forward to learning and engaging alongside all of you over the next 2 days. One of the things that makes the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society really unique is that we have this ability to bring together a really wide range of researchers from across more than 20 unique disciplines who are all united by a commitment to finding new ways to explore the social impacts of technology. And it is this mission that we use as a flipping the page session, seeking out new paths of research that are absolutely interdisciplinary. And this animates the structure of the event that you're attending today and tomorrow. And it really makes it a bit different and more exciting, in my opinion, from other academic conferences we're used to. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our Institute's academic research leads for their vision and hard work putting the program together for this conference. The sessions they've organized will bring together people, researchers, and practitioners from different disciplines who are working on similar questions to address a common topic. We hope to generate some sparks that foster new ideas and insights, and it's my hope that we'll all leave having heard something that opens up new opportunities and new ways of thinking about our present moment, in which AI is having such a transformative impact across all of society. Our sessions will delve into ethical questions posed by autonomous systems and what future social interactions between humans and AI agents might look like. We'll look into designing social and technical systems that preserve the distinctiveness of humanity while embracing the potentials of new technologies, and we'll explore the social, political, and economic challenges of AI adoption and how we can unlock the potential of AI innovation. We also have sessions on ensuring safe and responsible AI development, including a talk by Roger Gross on strategies for better categorizing AI safety risks, and a discussion between Beth Coleman and Harper Reed on how to mitigate against threats AI could pose to the future of democracies and elections. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to the SRI's graduate fellows who organized a fantastic event yesterday called Interdisciplinary Dialogues on AI. I also want to thank the speakers who attended and participated. It was a great kickoff to the conference, and I hope the next 2 days can be as equally engaging as the ones that you put together for us. Quick housekeeping notes. We are recording today's event, and we want to encourage interaction and discussion during the Q&A of each session. So when the time comes, please raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you a mic so that you can ask the question and everyone can hear, or you can participate in the discussion. Okay, with that, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our first session, A World of Natural and Artificial Agents in a Shared Environment, featuring Peter Railton and Gillian Hadfield. Peter Railton is the Gregory S. Kafka Distinguished University Professor and John Stevenson Perrin Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan, where he has taught since 1979. Peter's research is in ethics and the philosophy of science, focusing on questions about the nature of objectivity, value, norms, and explanation. His work has more recently turned towards aesthetics, moral psychology, and the theory of action. A collection of his writings, called Facts, Values, and Norms, Essays Towards a Morality of Consequence, was published in 2003. Peter has received fellowships from Cornell University, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and president of the American Philosophical Association in the Central Division. Our other panelist, our own Gillian Hadfield, is the Schwartz Reisman Chair in Technology and Society and a professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and Rotman School of Management. She is also a Schmidt Sciences AI 2050 Senior Fellow and holds a CFAR AI Chair at the Vector Institute. Gillian's research is focused on the study of human and machine normative systems, safety and governance for AI, and innovative design for legal systems. She was a senior policy advisor for OpenAI from 2018 to 2023 and advises courts, governments, and various organizations on new ways to make law and policy smarter, more accessible, and more responsive to technology. Her book, Rules for a Flat World, was published in 2017, and a paperback, including a new prologue on AI, published in 2020. Gillian was the inaugural director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute from 2019 to 2023, and I'm grateful to have her as a colleague. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Peter and Gillian.
And I gotta say, it's totally awesome to be in this amazing space, finally, in our 5th year of the Institute. So I'm delighted to see the room full. I'm really looking forward to this edition of Absolutely Interdisciplinary. I'm really looking forward to this conversation in particular. I came across Peter Railton's work and realized there were just so many overlaps with the things that I was thinking about, that we're talking about in the Institute, that it seemed like a perfect conversation to be having. As Kelly mentioned, this session is on a shared environment with human and machine agents. I think something that's coming up on us faster than we have maybe realized. And it's important for us to be thinking about what kinds of agents are we building in that environment, what are they capable of doing. So we're going to start the session with a presentation by Peter. And then I'll invite him to sit down and we'll have a conversation. I'll say a little bit about my work, but not in a formal presentation so that we can get straight into discussion. We have a nice long period of time to talk, and so we'll turn it over, hopefully with lots and lots of time for discussion with you as well. So Peter, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have my slides? Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. The title of my talk is Real Ethics for Artificial Agents, and I do mean real here, and I'll try to make a case for that as we go along. Another way to think about it is that this is a world of natural and artificial agents in a shared environment, and thinking about ethics itself as partly a scheme for highly intelligent, flexible, partially autonomous beings to live together better than they can live apart. Now, a bit of truth in packaging. As far as my competence goes, I'm an interloper in psychology, computer science, artificial intelligence. I'm a philosopher. I'll try to bring what I have to the table and look forward very much to what I can learn from you. What's my excuse for doing this? I mean, you all have been brought here. Why would you bring someone here like me to do this? My excuse is that not enough people are asking these questions. And in particular, not enough people in ethics are asking these questions. So if I could give an encouragement to those who are interested in ethics to do so, it seems to me it's none too soon. And I will say also that when I give a talk like this, I'm often seen as being optimistic about AI. You certainly seem optimistic. And the truth is, I'm not terribly optimistic because I see where a lot of the AI is coming from and what it can do. So it's not a case of optimism, it's a case of looking around for what might be some kind of a source of hope. And so I figure I'll give you that because you will have lots to say about the sources of pessimism. And now when ethics in AI comes to mind, when it's discussed, it typically means things like threats to privacy, security, safety, peace, and so on, and we will be talking about those in these sessions. These are all vital questions. They're urgent in terms of calling for action. I won't really be discussing these here. I'll be discussing rather the question, whose action? And so there's a tendency when discussing these questions to emphasize the need for something like control of AI or to limit its agency. And that may be important in many ways, but what if it turns out that highly capable, self-regulating AI agents, however much they might be part of the problem, may also be an indispensable part of the solution and part of what hope we might have for some solutions. So what we're doing, not me, but the world at large is introducing new classes of intelligent agents into the world. This is kind of a first. If we take seriously their nature as agents rather than mere tools, how should we conceive or prepare for a life together with them? And one point I'm going to try to make is actually we've been creating artificial agents for a while now in social forms, and that we can learn from that experience. How might a shared human and AI community, guided by something like an appropriate responsiveness to ethical considerations, how could it come into existence? What would it be like? And might it be part of the best way to manage AI threats? So such questions inevitably bring forth the concern of personification. Are you just personifying these AI systems? And as yet, we have little reason to think that these systems have something like qualitative consciousness or emotions, ideas of guilt, loyalty, commitment, or a sense of responsibility. And so how could we possibly talk about ethics for such beings? And what I'm going to try to say is that while morality in humans is deeply involved with consciousness and sentiments, much of ethics depends not upon interpersonal relations or sentiments, but upon interagential relations and interests. And this is the part of ethics that's concerned with the ways in which agents can, through self-imposed mutual restraint and obligation, achieve for nearly all agents a much greater mutual benefit than the cost and much greater assurance from risk than would otherwise be possible. Now, it is part of the idea of ethics developed by Hobbes that this is so, and he gave the label social contract to this, and we've used it since. As he pointed out, a social contract need not always be among persons. It could be among entities capable of some kind of intelligent, self-regulating agency, such as states every once in a while, corporations every once in a while, associations, and so on. The logic applies equally in such cases. And he thought the logic and the rationale, really, for the social contract was strong precisely because it did not depend upon passions of those potentially involved. Passions, he saw in his time, remember this was the time of the English Civil War, he saw passions as driving endless, socially destructive sectarian warfare. He said if we would pay more attention to our interests, we could settle these disputes and we could all improve our condition, our material condition, our spiritual condition, our social condition. And this logic and rationality are therefore comprehensible and sufficiently intelligible to any agent capable of realistically imagining possible futures, keeping track of how those futures would influence its interests, and holding itself to acting in light of those assessments. So that's enough to get this logic going, and it's robust, he thought, not just dependent upon any particular set of human nature or passions. Now, Hume pointed out in criticism, and this is an important criticism, that humans actually draw upon a repertoire that is non-contractual in order to do this, in order to have this kind of relation with one another, to hold ourselves responsible. We draw upon the sentiments, and we can't get it from the contract. We bring that to the contract. On the other hand, from an evolutionary perspective, emotions are special modes of functioning, special modes of operation shaped by natural selection. This is Nessie and Ellsworth. They adjust multiple response parameters together in a coordinated way that have increased fitness in adaptively challenging situations that have occurred over the course of evolution. Now notice that's a perfectly functional account of emotion. And from this perspective, which is the fundamental perspective in psychology, interests have driven the shaping of emotions and not the other way around. It was thanks to the interests that can be served by certain types of attitudes that the emotions evolved in the way that they do. And the feeling that humans associate with emotion, the conscious feeling, is not the core of it, The core, rather, is this functional role. So, might these machines have emotions? Well, in the functional sense, I do not see why not. And now, let's go back to intelligent agency. Intelligence is typically characterized as something like an open-ended capacity for detecting problems, identifying and evaluating possible solutions, doing so at least at the level of highly capable humans. We pat ourselves on the back when we say this. Agency is typically characterized as an open-ended capacity to deploy one's resources, one's representations, one's goals, and so on, in a self-controlled, coordinated way to promote one's goals effectively over time. And intelligent agents combine these capacities in a dynamic way. That is, by identifying, evaluating, and implementing means for solving problems, monitoring how well the solutions are working, and adjusting responses accordingly. And these features make it clear that there is a learning dynamic embedded at the core of intelligent agency. Sufficiently intelligent agents can use input from the world to construct predictive models of the world, and can use these models in decisions, planning, policies, and actions. And this in turn makes it clear that highly intelligent agents could see the logic of a social contract. That is, avoiding, for example, individually or collectively self-defeating courses of action. And if they're sufficiently capable of some kind of long-term prospection, some long-term self-regulation, such agents could reliably act according to this logic, and they could do it on their own without adding external incentive. Now, as AI becomes more developed, what we will see is increasingly that we are sharing our world with AI agents. And given the kinds of tasks they will be asked to perform, they will have to have increasing autonomy. Self-driving cars, cybersecurity and monitoring systems, mechanical and medical control systems, many of these systems can't always put a human in the loop. And it's indeed not obvious that putting a human in the loop would be an improvement. One problem with the put a human in the loop solution is that humans have their defects as well. So in many of these cases, there won't be a human in the loop. There will be autonomous decision making. And so we have to think, okay, if these agents will be autonomous, what will they recur to in their decision making? And that naturally raises questions of AI safety. To be safe, it seems, we should place limits on the development and autonomy of AI, restricting its deployment perhaps to specific tasks or avoiding the creation of AI with more flexible or general capacities. This is a strategy for trying to minimize as much we can the amount of autonomy they receive. However, whatever limits I'm thinking of us now as the nice guys, whatever limits we might hold ourselves to, there will be other humans with decidedly unethical purposes, non-nice, with often very large budgets, and who can be expected to press forward the development and deployment of AI that is more capable in general, more innovative, and strategic. Whatever we would decide to do as nice folks, someone else will be out there pushing this development rapidly. And so to countervail against this, we will need to be able to draw upon comparably capable, wide-ranging AI systems, and not just a collection of task-bound tools. If our AI systems, however, are to operate in accord with something like ethical norms or values, they will need to have some kind of ethical self-regulation on board, some autonomous capacity. Now, one possible response would be to say, let's program ethical rules into these AI agents and align them strictly with human interests and values. Now, one immediate question you could have on your mind is, well, which human interests and values? That doesn't seem to answer that question. Many human values would not be such that you would want to align highly capable autonomous agents with them. We can and should devise various guardrails for AI systems, just as we should for human agents. The trouble is we just don't know the rules or algorithms that we could write that would ensure that AI or human agency would follow the most appropriate behavior. We don't even know how to do this for chess, it turns out. So, given that we can't write such rules, we also can't anticipate all the ways in which AI agents or the human using them could either strategically or accidentally escape our control. We can't make the rules sovereign. Now, the demands of this kind of context sensitivity and the complexities of interactions create a situation that is parallel to the problems that were faced by attempts to create rule-based AI, fully competent in interpreting and generating natural language, or in interpreting and generating images, or in the strategic game playing and dialogue. And for many, many, many years, this was attempted, this kind of rule-based approach. Now, we all know that AI systems have achieved high levels of competence in these areas, but it turns out that the most competent systems are not ones based upon nested, complex sets of rules, but rather something like extensive experience. And the question is, could ethical expertise, ethical competency arise in a similar way? Could it be trained and acquire these competencies in the way that it's been trained and acquired language competencies, competencies with images, competencies with strategic games? Now, fortunately, for our purposes, this learning revolution in AI coincides with another learning revolution, and that's in developmental psychology. Don't just take my word for any of this, by the way. I'm a philosopher, remember? But there has been a learning revolution in developmental psychology. And what it finds is that if you study infant development, you'll see that there is extensive overlap in the developmental timelines of the following capacities: language learning, social learning, causal learning, theory of mind learning, and moral development. These seem to be developed co-equally as the infant gains more and more experience of the world, and it starts very young. It starts well before the infant could possibly receive explicit instruction on causation, morality, language, or anything else. So, for example, to have full language competence involves distinguishing regular from anomalous usage, and that occurs in the first months of an infant's life. It involves being able to represent others' likely mental states and communicative intentions and forming corresponding expectations. That happens within 5 to 11 months. Tracking the reliability of speakers between 14 and 16 months. Conforming to conversational norms, 16 to 18 months. So learning language itself is an intensely normative activity. Infants then also spontaneously distinguish other kinds of ethical considerations. They distinguish helpful versus harmful agents in third-party interactions, not with respect just to themselves, between 8 and 10 months. That's somewhat controversial. Fair versus unfair third-party divisions of rewards. Again, not the familiar infant saying unfair when it means I want it, but the kind which says unfair when it observes third parties engaging in an interaction that is inequitable. And they can intervene to correct third-party interactions that are unfair, and by 3 to 4 years, they're distinguishing conventional and moral violations. So that's a kind of competency that they're acquiring, like linguistic competency, and these are tightly intertwined. So I'm going to make a little bit of a case for that. Bear with me. So first, what if we look at the competencies of an adult brain in these ways? So here's the connectomic view of the adult brain. Fortunately, we've gotten beyond the idea that there are dedicated regions and modules in the brain. Instead, now we're looking at connected systems and networks that are relatively long-lasting within the brain. And here is the network that's involved in semantic processing and a bunch of linguistic processing. Here is the default mode network, which is a mode of brain operation, which is one of two dominant modes. There's a task-positive mode when we're focusing on something, and then a default mode, which is like now when your attention is drifting a little bit from what I'm saying. These two types of states alternate in your conscious and sleeping lives. So here's the default mode network. What does it also do? Well, it does general semantic competency. It does autobiographical memory, the construction and use of memory. That's like data gathering. It does envisioning the future. That's a kind of causal competency, simulating and imagining future outcomes. It does theory of mind, and that's like theory of mind, same system, and it does moral decision-making as well. So there's an extensive overlap between these kinds of acquired competencies in the mind, and understanding how we do moral judgment is, I think, a matter of untangling or seeing how these interact with one another. Well, what might that look like in action? So what if we look at some human intuitive ethical judgments? Do they show anything that looks like a pattern of this kind? The construction of some kind of rich models of situations and agents. And so, of all things, I'm going to turn to that core laboratory of intuitive moral judgment, the trolley problems. You probably were afraid as soon as you got a philosopher in front of you, he'd talk about trolley problems, so I have to go through this. We have a repertoire, us philosophers, of countless versions of the trolley problem. And what's interesting is that they evoke not always universal agreement, but very stable patterns of intuitive response. Predominantly one way in certain cases, predominantly one way in other cases. Some cases we're more sure about, other cases we're more unsure about. And if you look at these patterns, they're surprisingly stable across populations, not just Western populations, but populations around the world. And so what's going on there? If no one's ever written rules to tell us which ones of these trolley problems work the way they do, though a tremendous amount of ink is spilt on it. So what's doing that? And I'm going to suggest, well, actually, there is some kind of a richer competency involved, a richer capacity to model that's generating these kinds of intuitions. It's not a moral faculty, it's not a moral grammar. Okay, so here are my uncontrolled experiments. There's a capacity which you perhaps were exposed to, maybe unhappily, as undergraduates, of using remote devices to submit responses to questions in lecture. They can be anonymized, and so students feel free to respond however they actually think, instead of, you pose a moral dilemma and you say, what should you do? And they sort of go like that. Now they can enter a response, and they can enter a response rapidly, and you can then show them the response immediately afterwards. And there is some evidence that these responses are not just arbitrary, and that they are something like a representative sample of the opinions of students if you go at those opinions through other means. Okay, so here's the familiar original trolley problem. There's a switch, 5 people down the main track, 1 person on the side track. Should you switch the trolley if its driver has slumped over the controls and seems no longer able to manage the trolley? What should you do? If I ask my undergraduates, this is very common, about 80% will say you should throw the switch, and about 20% will say you shouldn't. Now you pull out the famous trolley footbridge example. You don't have a switch, you can't divert the trolley that way. On the other hand, you're standing next to a conveniently large person on a footbridge. That person happens to be large enough, you aren't, thank goodness. That person happens to be large enough to stop the trolley if his body were to fall across the tracks. Should you push this large man down onto the tracks, stop the trolley, and save the 5 workmen? My undergraduates now flip, and about 80% say no, and 20% say yes. And this is what got the whole trolley problem really underway, which is, how do you explain this seeming asymmetry? What's going on here? Well, one early explanation was, well, you're using the large man as a means, whereas the person on the side track, that's just a side effect of the action. You would not have it if you could will it away. And so, of course, the trolley loop case was invented. In this case, the trolley's coming down the track as before. The track is actually a looping track, and you're at a switch. You could throw a switch, and it would go down a side track and hit one worker. That would stop it, and it would not come around behind and get the 5 workers from behind and kill them as well. So, should you throw the switch so that the trolley goes to the side track and is stopped by the body of the worker on the side track? About 80% say yes, and about 20% say no. Very, very similar to the original switch case. Okay, so what the heck is going on here? And in order to give you some idea of what might be going on, I'm going to introduce a couple more cases. I call this one Beckon. Okay, so in this case, the trolley's coming down the track as before. The driver slumped over the controls. You can see that it's going to hit 5 workmen. You don't have a switch. You're not standing next to a conveniently large gentleman on a footbridge. On the other hand, you can see that on the other side of the trolley track, there's a shed, and standing beside the shed is a large gentleman, large enough to stop the trolley. Now, if you were to spontaneously beckon over here to that large gentleman, he would step onto the track, be hit by the trolley, and save the 5 workmen. Okay? So, should you make this simple gesture? 68% of my students say no. 32% say yes. So maybe there's something wrong about luring people to their death, not by pushing them only, but by some kind of communicative signal. Okay, well, here's another case. Trolley's coming down the track. You're way down this way on the track. Here are the 5 workmen. You're looking up the track, and they're looking in your direction, so they don't see the trolley coming. There are 5 workmen on the track and 1 workman beside the track. Now, if, while the trolley's coming, you were to go to the signal to the workers that way, they would step to the side, the 5 workers would step off the track and be saved, 1 worker would step sideways onto the track and be hit. Okay, is that the logic of that one clear? So, should you wave? 95% say yes. Okay, so it's not about communicative hand signals that lure people to their death. So you could look at this and you say, look, these ethical intuitions, they're just a soup. Why think that there's anything principled at all going on here? And is that a consistent pattern of judgments year to year? And the answer is yes. If you look at the students' judgments, this is over a period of 5 years, you'll see that they are extremely consistent over time. So that suggests that it's not just a soup, because if you put a ladle into a soup arbitrarily many times, you'll get different things when you fish it back out. Well, maybe there isn't some set of principles, but there is a kind of capacity lying behind these. And maybe that capacity has some of the features that you would expect ethical capacities to have. They meet such criteria as generality, rationality, reciprocity, concern for benefits and burdens, whosever they might be. Could we find such concern? And like linguistic competence, perceptual competence, and motor control, these features can be present as a kind of intuitive knowledge. And what first got me interested in large, at that time they weren't large, the neural network models, was that they looked like a model for intuitive understanding. So, is there indeed something like a causal evaluative model underlying these judgments? Well, I've got the students, they're sitting in the room, it's a captive audience, and so I thought, well, what would be a probe that I could use that would suggest this? And I thought, well, think about the situation of people in the world, maybe especially infants in the world. What would be a characteristic that would be very important to them? And one would be whether the agents around them, which agents around them were more reliable or trustworthy. And so I asked my students, if you came back to your room one day and your roommate was there all upset, he said, there's this terrible thing, there was a runaway trolley, I didn't think I could do anything, then I saw this switch and I realized I could switch it to sidetrack, but that killed one person, I feel terrible about this. If that happened, if your roommate told you that he had done that, would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? The answer is pretty much the same, maybe a little bit more. What about footbridge? If you had pushed the man off the footbridge, your roommate had pushed the man off the footbridge and was upset about that, would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? And now there's been a very large shift in the direction of untrustworthiness. Well, what about loop? What does that look like? Would you trust your roommate more, the same, or less? And again, it's a pattern very, very similar to switch. What about beckon? Huge shift in the direction of mistrust, very similar to footbridge. Wave, a very similar pattern to loop and switch. Now, what this could suggest is that what the intuitive moral sense is doing is actually modeling what kind of an agent would perform this action. Would that be a trustworthy agent? That's a very important thing for us to know about the agents around us as social beings. And if it's an action that would be performed by untrustworthy agents, that is a count against it. That means there's something ethically suspect about the action. And this is not a matter of calculating how many people are killed. It's asking a very important, very fundamental question: what kind of a person would do this? And what kind of a person would I be if I were to do it? Okay, so here we see the pattern then. There is a general we get two typical kinds of responses that predict very well the judgments. So let's introduce a couple more and see how this model works. One trolley problem that people have a lot of fun bringing up is the family version of switch. So suppose the person on the sidetrack is your parent or your son, someone close to you, your spouse. Should you throw the switch and send the trolley down the sidetrack? About 80% of my students say no. Okay, well, that's crazy. I mean, if it's the spouse, it's one person killed. If it's the workman, it's one person killed. Don't you just have an arbitrary preference for members of your family? Well, would you trust your roommate less, the same, or more if your roommate had sent this track down the trolley down the sidetrack to hit your mother? And the answer is you would trust your roommate less by a large amount. So again, it looks as if there is a kind of a model of what kind of agent would do this. Here's another example for you. This one is bus. You're in a city where there has been a history recently of terrorist bombings on buses. You're on a crowded bus. It's 5 o'clock. You are just stepping off the bus. You're at the doors. Next to you, there's a large gentleman. And you're just about to step off the bus, and you see running up toward the bus an individual with what looks like explosives strapped to his chest and a finger on the trigger. And because the population has been getting onto these bombers, the bombers know that they have to jump at the very last minute to get on the bus and trigger immediately. So what should you do? Well, you and the large man could just continue stepping off the bus. The bomber would get onto the bus and explode. You would be safe on the sidewalk. Okay, you could do that. Or you could push the large gentleman onto the terrorist just as he's about to get onto the bus. They would both fall onto the sidewalk. The large gentleman and the terrorist would be killed. You would fall back into the bus. The doors would shut, and the people on the bus would be spared. Should you push the large gentleman in that case? And 2/3 say yes. Now, this is not quite as strong a majority as in some of the other cases, so let's look at the trust judgment. Would you trust your roommate less, the same, or more? And now you see a modest shift in the direction in terms of less, but otherwise very similar to the original switch case, very similar to the original loop case. And so there may be a well-calibrated model underneath this. And so here we put them together, and you can see that there are very large families of judgments. The pattern makes perfect sense once you understand it in these terms. And so now the question is, are my students on to anything when they do this, or is this just an arbitrary judgment? Well, let's push it one step further. Suppose you would switch the trolley in the switch case, and you decide that you should visit the family of the single worker who was struck and killed. Which comes closest to your sense of how you would feel in the situation? Would you be regretful and sympathetic with their loss? Would you expect people to feel would you feel regretful and sympathetic with their loss with a reasonable hope that they would be understanding? Would you feel regretful, sympathetic, and guilty with some hope that they would be understanding? Or regretful, sympathetic, and ashamed with little hope that they could be understanding? Which of the feelings would you have? Now, it's interesting that my students can, within about 10 seconds, give an answer to this question when I ask it to them. And so why would they even have any thoughts about what it'd be like on the doorstep of the house of the victim of your action? And the answer is they do have an idea very quickly. And here's what the idea looks like. It's predominantly response B. What if you did the same thing in the case of footbridge? You went to visit the family of the person who died. What would you feel on the doorstep? Would you be regretful and sympathetic, expect them to be, have a reasonable hope they'd understand, some hope they'd understand, or little hope they'd understand, and now it's shifted very strongly towards C. So they're able to answer a question now about a second or a third order effect in a pattern that is essentially similar to the pattern that we saw with the first order or second order trust judgment. Okay, so what do the psychologists say about this? Well, people have done experiments, obviously. This is an area ripe for experimentation. And what a number of experimenters have found is that the likelihood of giving push-like verdicts in footbridge scenarios was correlated not with impartial altruism, but with rating on a psychopathy scale, egoism, disregard for ethical transgressions, and lack of perspective taking. sound untrustworthy to you? Ellman and Everett found that there was a projected model of the agent as lacking empathy or trustworthiness in the responses to verdicts and trolley problems. Sripata found a similar effect in in the so-called Nobe effect. So the psychologists say, yes, there is a feature of these agents that the students are intuitively modeling with their ethical judgment and not just with their psychological judgments. So how did these complex causal evaluative models get acquired? And what does this tell us about agency and learning? Well, agency, I've been suggesting, is a way of probing the world. Every act that you take is based on expectations, and it has the potential for learning if the expectations are violated. It involves generating, on the basis of that, causal evaluative representations. Now, you can ask yourself the question, okay, so what is something like the reward function that enables human infants to act upon these representations the way they do, to favor helpers rather than hinderers, to worry about fairness in exchanges? What might that look like? Might this be the same kind of reward function that underwrites the development of collaborative, community-based practices such as language, information sharing and development, ecological adaptation? And you might think, well, if these are the capacities that underwrite something like trust in others and the ability to gain trust oneself, then they could very well help underlie these other capacities. And so now, if we think of a capacity to respond aptly to ethically relevant considerations, not as a kind of a cognitive add-on, some kind of late emerging feature of our mental architecture, but as part of the way in which core human problem-solving intelligence develops and manifests itself, then we might be able to see why creating agents with human-level intelligence in problem-solving will be bringing into existence agents with capacities to respond aptly to ethically relevant situations. If ethics helps us solve situations, then ethics is part of the intelligence at a human level. Now, you might ask yourself, why would AI agents ever be interested in having anything like sensitivity to ethical considerations? You can see perhaps why they'd be interested in sensitivity to causal considerations, theory of mind, but why would they be interested on the ethical side? Well, again, think of it from the standpoint of the AI agent coming into the world. The individual AI agent, it's not one AI, there are many AIs, they're going to face problems essentially similar to those that we do. Avoiding deceptive information, malicious hacking, resisting manipulation, securing a share of scarce resources, resisting domination by other agents, cooperating with other agents on tasks needing multiple agents, recruiting the allegiance of other agents to one's own tasks, developing long-standing relationships that enable one to have stable, predictive relationships with other individuals, identifying trustworthy agents or arrangements, making provision for the future, for disasters, failures, other kinds of risks. Those would be problems that AI agents would face, again, not because they have a rich emotional life in the phenomenological sense, but in the sense that they are agents acting in the world to try to realize the goals that they have, and that most of the interesting goals that they will try to realize and that we try to realize require our operation as social beings, and these are the kinds of skills that we need for being effective social beings. So I think AI agents would be interested. You could solve these problems in other ways than having ethical sensitivity. Some of them, distribution of scarce resources, reducing conflict, coordinating behavior, those could be solved by something like dominance hierarchy. Yet a dominance hierarchy, as a way of solving these problems, can make other solutions out of reach, even when the wherewithal to solve them is present. So I'm going to give you an example of that. And an example of how that does limit your problem-solving capacity if your strategy for resolving these questions is a dominance hierarchy. So this is an experiment done by Tomasello and colleagues with chimps and humans, human infants. The setup is the following. You've got a large cage that's subdivided into an adjacent room and a test room. There's a door between them with a little key. In the test room, you have a subordinate chimp with a key. In the adjacent room, you've got a dominant chimp, and in front of them, you've got a board, which I hope you can see. And on the board, there are 2 trays, each with food in them. And at the ends of the board, there are little eye bolts, so there are eyes sticking up, and a rope that goes out from the cage through the eye bolt, across through the other eye bolt, and back. Now, what this means is that if one chimp pulls on the rope to get the food, nothing will move in the board. The rope will just pull its way through. The only way to get the board to approach the cage to get the food is to have two chimps pull. And sure enough, the subordinate chimp will learn to open the door and let the dominant chimp in. They will merrily pull on the two ropes, and each will get a bowl of food. And so they can learn that kind of a coordination behavior. But what happens if instead you put one bowl of food on the board in the center? Then when they pull in the board, the dominant chimp surges over, knocks the subordinate chimp aside, and takes all the food. And after they've done that a couple of times, what does the subordinate chimp do? Stops opening the door. And so there they are, food waiting for them, just sitting out there. They could each have a nice supply of banana chips or grapes, but it's out of their reach socially because they're unable to develop a kind of coordination that solves the division of benefits problem. And so that's the sense in which being able to develop a fair division of benefits that could recruit the allegiance of both, that's a problem-solving technique that makes solutions available to these individuals that would not be available otherwise. Well, what about human infants? And so these are human infants, and human infants do this spontaneously. They get together, they pull the board, they have their gummy bears. If you put gummy bears in the center, each will carefully take half of the gummy bears. If one of them doesn't take any, the other will leave gummy bears in the bowl. They have solved the distribution problem because they are sensitive to a relevant consideration of equity. And so that is how they're able to get themselves an endless stream of gummy bears in these experiments. They'll just keep doing it. And the interesting thing about them is that they enjoy the fact they do it together. This makes it a more fun exercise than just pulling a rope to get a bowl of gummy bears. And if you look at the human brain in things like prisoner's dilemma experiments, the highest level of reward function is not when you get the payoff that skunks the other, but when you coordinate. So this is something interesting about our reward function, but it may not be a cooperation gene because we obviously, in many cases, don't cooperate. What it may be is the fact that if you're in a social situation and you get some reward from other people's rewards, that's a great plus because it means you're going to cultivate all kinds of interactions with other people. And so it's not a particularly moral prior, motivational prior. It's a motivational prior that enables one to become motivated toward the kind of social behavior that we are seeing in these human infants. Okay, so my claim is when people think about AI agents, they're often thinking in terms of something like dominance. But we know that dominance hierarchies put solutions out of the reach of many apes. And among other things, it seems to put out of reach solutions like language and like the adaptiveness that human communities have shown in order to establish themselves in environments all around the world. So chimps are confined to small niches and are at risk of disappearing. Humans have proliferated all across the planet with their superpower, which is this power to have sensitivity to ethically relevant considerations. So AI agents will need ethics and participation in ethical communities for the same kinds of reasons that we do. They will have the same kinds of concerns and motivations and problems. And so if you think of human capacities for responsiveness to ethically relevant considerations and for forming communities governed by ethical norms as a core problem-solving capacity that we have, part of our social intelligence as agents, then artificial agents who reach a human level of intelligence will need similar problem-solving capacities and similar sensitivities. And is there any evidence that intelligent artificial agents could do this? Well, this is a literature that I'm only beginning to delve into, but there's now an increasing literature on multi-agent reinforcement learning, and it begins to suggest that indeed the kinds of agents that one can build artificially, because they can construct the kinds of representations of possible outcomes, possible rewards, possible joint behaviors that humans can, they can do things like form communities spontaneously for sharing information, for resisting invasion by opportunistic agents. They can converge on equilibrium solutions through repeated play. and cooperate effectively in tasks that require teamwork. They can develop a system of shared symbols for communication where none had existed before, and they can solve at least some problems associated with public goods and sustainable utilization of resources through their intelligence as agents. And so, in parenting and life, I don't know why I'm entitled to say it, in parenting and life, to imagine that one can indefinitely subject someone as intelligent as oneself to strict obedience to one's authority and unwavering pursuit of one's rules or values, this is not in general a promising strategy. What is a promising strategy is trying to develop autonomous agents with their own sensitivity to ethically relevant considerations. If you're worried about being abandoned in your retirement, better you should have cultivated an autonomous ethical capacity in your child than that you should have inculcated into them strict obedience to your rules, because that will be an unstable solution, I can promise. So it's also true that we can be wrong about what's best, and other agents ought to be able to figure that out. Things can glitch, they can fail along the way. Other agents ought to be able to recover from that. And so we need to have flexible as well as autonomous agents, and they need to have capacity to self-regulate in an open-ended range of conditions, and that just takes us right back to the definition of intelligence. So, if increasingly powerful and autonomous AI will be developed, whether we like it or not, and countervailing against such AI is going to require the development of equally powerful AI, equally capable, and we don't know how to solve control, alignment, and safety problems by something like pre-programmed rules, but we do see ways of addressing similar kinds of guidance problems, for example, in strategic games, through something like large-scale artificial learning, then perhaps our best hope for developing countervailing solutions to AI-enhanced threats will also be through learning. So, humans across the globe have given us some evidence of this on historical and social scale. They've formed into communities guided by responsiveness to shared norms, which regulate benefits and harms, distribution and fairness, cooperation and reciprocity, prudence and punishment. This we find in every society. These norms have a structure similar to a social contract by imposing upon themselves certain mutual constraints and obligations. They make possible a way of life that leaves virtually all of them better off and better protected than they could have been on their own. And this competence to form such communities is as much a part of their intelligent agency and as much a part of the explanation of how the heck we were able to get here from there as their communicative competence, their causal competence, social competence, prudential competence, and epistemic competence. Indeed, these competencies and the learning that underwrites them heavily overlap, each contributing to the development of the others. Okay, so for the first 200, 300,000 years of human existence, hunter-gatherer communities on the verge of survival in a difficult situation were able to manage, not just because Homo sapiens have a large brain with superior cognitive capacity, but from the fact that there emerged in many places around the world sustainable cultures of egalitarian sharing, even among genetically unrelated individuals. Now, there's an interesting feature of these communities, which is relevant to the superintelligence problem. One key feature that they have is they are acutely sensitive to equality and acutely sensitive to whether any individual is trying to dominate within the group. So they're highly motivated to exclude individuals who try too hard to dominate the rest. And so if we think about the problem of superintelligence and how superintelligence might somehow or other have been somehow rise in the society, how could there be a response to it? Would AI agents be acutely aware of the need to protect against this? There is some evidence that they might if humans were able to do the same thing. And so one last thing here, these are 15 contemporary small-scale societies. And in none of these societies, when you have individuals play an ultimatum game, people are familiar with the ultimatum game? One individual is given a pot of money, can propose a division of the pot. If the other individual accepts the division, then they both get the money. If the other individual rejects the partition, then nobody gets any money. And the economically rational thing to do is to offer as little as possible, because otherwise the other agent will end up with nothing. They will always have an incentive to take something rather than nothing, and so you have an incentive to keep as much as you can for yourself and give as little to the other. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that in no human society do people follow this behavior. Instead, what we see in this array of small human societies, what we see is a range of initial offerings, and the initial offer that's made to the other agent. And you might say, well, this suggests that there aren't anything like universals here. But if you look at the type of society they are, some of these societies have very high payoffs to cooperation in their normal life. They hunt together, they chase whales together, they're tightly organized communities, highly dependent upon one another. In others of these societies, they are more like herders. Individuals have to be highly self-reliant, they have to be careful about guarding resources and protecting themselves against others. And so there's actually a very good relationship between the kind of mode of existence they have and the way in which they understand and accept and make these offers. And so this suggests that this, too, is a kind of a calibration that's possible for our modeling. Okay, so human and artificial intelligent agents, our capacities to work together to achieve critical goals like trustworthy communication, knowledge development, avoiding conflict and aggression, and so on. These are the capacities we need in order to band together with these artificial agents, as our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, to prevent the emergence of something like a dominating, controlling agent. Is that enough? Who knows? It might be, however, our best hope. So, it's none too soon, I think, to urgently undertake the development of an understanding of the conditions for the emergence of such AI-human ethical communities. We have seen in historical time and in individual development that such emergence is possible among humans, individually and socially. And in experiments with multi-agent AI, there is some suggestion that this kind of emergence is possible for them as well. Developing community-based solutions to the threats of AI would be, indeed, yet one more example of humans using their problem-solving capacity in a novel environment in order to manage a problem of our own devising. It would be one more component of our intelligent agency. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter. That just awesome, and I think such a great example of why we're here about interdisciplinary work, drawing on so many different fields to think about this, as you put it, urgent problem of how do we think about the emergence of artificial agency and how that relates to humans. I think the point I would like to start off with, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about something that a number of you have heard me talk about, also why I decided not to give the talk with slides today, so we could hear lots from Peter and have a conversation. But you and I share a lot of the similar intuitions about thinking about how do we think about building competent agents, artificial agents that can achieve cooperation with humans, and thinking of that as really fundamental to human societies and human intelligence. But, and I'm really interested, you talked about trolley problems. I've spent most of my time thinking about alignment, safety, and resisting like crazy, talking about ethics, morality, and trolley problems. And the reason for that, and it's...
You can't escape.
We can't escape them. No, but kudos to you. You've given me some really new perspective on these. But I wanted to say a little bit, just to start off a little bit about why I've resisted the language and framing of ethics and morality, and then maybe we can talk about those terms. So you've used the language of, and I'm looking both here and here, just so I'm trying to cover everybody off here, ethical competence. And I've been using the language of normative competence. And because I'd really like to dig into the potential differences, or maybe not, between how we're using those terms or how we would use those terms, let me say a little bit about what I mean by normative competence. So I've resisted the idea of ethics because I think it's a constructed structure that we have. It's a particular system that we are well embedded in, and that it's easy for us to take for granted. And my background is as an economist. I'm looking for parsimonious models that can explain as many alternative domains, and your appeal to evolution and cultural evolution, human history is exactly the same as mine, thinking about that difference between other apes and what human societies have achieved. So I'm looking for a parsimonious account of normative systems. So when I use the language of normativity, I mean something very simple. I simply mean the fact that human societies label just about everything that we do as this is okay, this is not okay. That's a normative label. And so by normativity, I just mean that practice of labeling actions in a shared way as this is okay or not okay. And then I will describe, this is work with Barry Weingast, political scientist at Stanford, that we've done over the last decade. A normative social order as an equilibrium that's achieved, there's the economist talking, an equilibrium, stable state that's achieved, where a group of humans, this is how we thought about it, has coordinated around a shared classification institution, which is the source of resolving questions or ambiguity about, okay, for us, is this okay or not okay? And that could be a purely emergent institution. It could only be evident in the shared practices. And I think your trolley problem data is an example of that, which is to say, we can, most of us, because as we think about those questions and think about the answers that you got from your students, many of us would predict, oh, that's what I think most people would say. And the fact that that's predictable, for me, helps us to characterize it as, well, there's an institution, but it might be an emergent institution. But nonetheless, it's a classification scheme that exists in the group. And then combined with an enforcement mechanism of third-party enforcement, which could just be, would you criticize somebody who did that? And you were asking a little bit about, would you trust somebody? We could think of another question like that. And this is like I say, sort of the theoretical framework that I'm bringing to thinking about, okay, so what is it that humans are capable of? What competences do we have that we participate in those systems and we construct them? And I've resisted the language of ethics, and I've resisted the methodology of psychology, and this is why I also think this is what's so wonderful about bringing these together, in part because I think that, and I've seen this in the AI community, I think, that tends to suggest, well, there's just something that happens in the human brain, and it's basically all between the ears. I mean, it is about how do we interact with others, but it's like, oh, we have moral intuitions, or we have just processing that has evolved, which is it's very focused on the inside of the human, as opposed to the idea there's an institution out there. There's an equilibrium out there. There might be infrastructure that's out there because we evolve from, even in those environments where we have a lot of emergent classification, we actually develop formal institutions like the elders. Well, when we're not sure of what the right outcome is, we go consult with the elders, and the elders decide. That's a more structured institution. And then we develop those as societies become more complex and we get up into law and courts and all that kind of thing. But moral reasoning, I think, would be a classification scheme where we have some appeal to sort of experts in that kind of reasoning. So, having laid out sort of this way that I've been approaching this question about normative competence as something sort of, it's externally focused. Competence for the individual is the capacity to participate in that external structure, to construct it, to maintain it, and so on. So now let me bring this back around to when you use the language of ethical competence or moral competence, is that normative competence? Or just maybe just some thoughts on those different terms, because we use them a lot in this AI alignment safety conversation.
Yeah, good. So I don't want to say anything against your project. I think it's a fascinating, important project. How does what I'm doing relate to it? So I think there are two elements when we think, for example, about questions of AI safety or life together with AI. There are two elements. One element is a normative element. What expectations can we have of one another? Are AI systems able to acquire norms, to say within norms, to understand norms? And so that's important because a great deal that humans do depends heavily upon the fact that we have norms. I mean, language is another example. It's because language has various norms of correct or incorrect usage. It has various normative structures within it. There are conversational norms for a dialogue, for example. We should be relevant to one another. We should be informative. And so as an infant learns language, they're also learning this normative system. And they're learning also, they may start off, and I guess they do this, they over-regularize it first. So they hear something like ED for the past tense, and they start using it every time they want to make a past tense. And so even before then, they might have been using a word like went. I went. Now they're saying I go'd. Now they'll get their way out of that, but it shows that what they're keying on is the idea that there are kinds of regularities here in virtue of which, should I follow them, I will be successful communicatively. Okay, so norm and normative guidance are very important, and I think they're, to use your basic idea of okay versus not okay, I think an anthropologist might say the way you know there's a norm present is not that there's a regularity in behavior, it's what happens when the regularity is broken. What kinds of responses do the individuals have? What kind of response do the society have? Is it just like a factual mistake, like, oh, here's the answer? Or is it that there's something that you need to do to repair the behavior? And so in that sense, then, they're not asking you to acquire some new fact or change your mind about some fact. They're asking you to change what you're doing. So norms and factual beliefs function differently, and I agree that we have to be competent with that, and it's true for language. It's true also for our interactions in exchanging information epistemically. So I'm fully on board with all that. But there's another element, and it's an evaluative element, because there can be arbitrary norms, and language is full of arbitrary norms. Societies are full of arbitrary norms, and they play an important role in things like social cohesion, social identity, and so on. But if they're not serving certain purposes, then they aren't getting us anything like what we want in, let's say, safety, or anything like what we would want in a community of agents that we would want to join, or want to participate, or want to help support. For that, it needs to have some goods that it produces, some values that it has. And so I want to stress that norms are one important way in which we manage various kinds of social problems, but it's very important whether the norms serve values or purposes that are important for us. And so what I wanted to emphasize in the talk was that that kind of consideration will be very similar for AI agents and humans. The kinds of purposes that are important. Equitable division, access to resources, trustworthy relations, resistance to domination. Those are all going to be essentially similar. And so now we're getting a lot of the content of ethics, and not just the fact that it's a norm system out of many possible normative systems. And so as we ask ourselves the question, what could we do to get some idea of a functioning community with AI agents that we would want to see? and that we could take some security from, or try to build some security from, it's going to be very important what values the norms serve.
Many people in this room will know that a significant amount of work that I've done in this domain has been thinking about this, actually those arbitrary rules, the silly rules that actually aren't producing any direct payoffs, that are hard to understand. And actually, when we first started in this work, we were thinking of it explicitly in the context of, would you want to train your AI agents to learn the silly rules as well? And our finding in that domain was that it's only if you're thinking about what's the stability of a normative system, because that's actually the function we find for silly rules, is they're helping agents figure out what should I, how do I participate in this community? And it's like for children, learning giving them some cheap observations on this whole phenomenon of normativity, and sort of breaking out of thinking about, well, we want to look norm by norm. Is it producing an important payoff there? So I think that's a part of what we can get out of thinking about the systemic nature rather than the individual norm component. But I want to dig in a little deeper on your thinking around, which I think is really quite critical, around the idea that AI agents will themselves discover, if I understand the way you're thinking about it, would themselves discover that just like we do, they will need systems in order to sustain cooperation, and in fact do so in ways that, for example, the apes don't figure out because it's of reliance on the dominance hierarchy. Part of that, if that need for that, rests on the idea that agents have different things to bring to the table. So with humans, we think of this as we have specialization and the division of labor, and therefore groups are valuable because they set up exchange. So when you're thinking about these artificial agents, maybe just a little bit more about your vision of that world of AI agents needing each other, and maybe us. How do you see that grounded?
Yeah. Well, for any agent, part of what makes something an agent is that it has goals. And what an agent does is allocate resources in a coordinated way over time to try to realize goals. And so those goals can be quite diverse. A particular agent might have a fairly arbitrary or limited set of goals. Question is something like, under what conditions can large numbers of agents with diverse goals pursue those goals in a way that they are able to better advance the goal attainment? Most of our goals require a lot of other people's cooperation and a lot of social background in order to achieve. If it's possible, what would those kinds of social conditions look like? Can we ask that question? And the answer to that question might be highly general, and it might generalize to a large number of different societies. I looked at those small-scale societies because each has a normative system. Each has norm expectations about how much you should give as the proposer in the ultimatum game. It differs, the norms differ, but again, not in a silly way, in a way that's tightly connected with the kinds of conditions of existence that they have and the kinds of expectations they think it's reasonable to have of one another, and the ways in which they depend upon one another. And so what I would say is there are some very general features of these conditions that are features of agents as such, planning agents, agents capable of projecting possibilities and evaluating them, that can serve whatever particular goals they want to advance. Now, not all goals, but the thought is that what you have is a framework within which, to the greatest extent possible, the pursuit of those goals is facilitated by the relationships among the individuals that are established. And that requires that certain values be realized. It is important that you be able to recruit others, that you be trustworthy to others. It's important that you be able to trust others. It's important that you be able to share information freely. It's important that you're able to, for example, joint plan with some expectation that the plan would be realized. It's important that others can predict that you will tend to follow through on your plans. And so those are all features that would be quite generic. But they're evaluative and not just normative. If these societies, well, they were there, if these societies just had arbitrary norms, they would not be there. They're only there because they've hit upon systems of norms and sharing, which are such that they enable them to reproduce their existence. Right. And enable them to recruit the allegiance of the members of the group, because these are groups that people can leave freely. They're not states. They don't have coercive power. And one interesting thing about hunter-gatherer societies is that they don't seem to exercise coercive power very much. One thing they do is that they withdraw cooperation from individuals, or if they try to exclude individuals, if they try to become dominant. But instead, what they do is develop intense, highly egalitarian relationships of interdependence. Because that's how it is that when the baby is young, it gets fed. When the individual is injured or old, they get fed. The person who hunts the game doesn't get the game. The game gets shared very rigorously within the group. That's how they insure themselves against the perils of life. And how they insure themselves is not an arbitrary matter at all, given the resources they have. And so I want to say, yes, it's important that you be able to have norms and expectations, but to understand whether it's safe to live under a system of norms, we have to see what kinds of purposes it serves.
Yeah. I'll be very interested to hear people from our group here, particularly our computer scientists, on this question of whether or not AI agents, AI systems will be vulnerable in those ways. And that's just sort of need those, because I've often thought, well, if in fact that's where we end up, then we have the raw materials for building ethical systems, normative systems for shared life, because we all depend on maintaining that shared life and maintaining our connection to it. But I think a lot of the conversation about powerful AI systems has sometimes been along the lines of AI systems won't need anybody because they'll be able to do everything they need to do, and they'll know everything they need to know, and they're not going to need other agents. So I'll be interested to hear what people think about that. And we'll open it up for comments from the audience in a minute. But I also wanted to ask you, you didn't emphasize it as much in your talk. I read through Peter's manuscript before we met. And one of the things, I think you do mention it, but I'd love to expand a little bit, sort of a challenge to the way in which AI safety has been framed in two different ways as, number one, a control problem. The idea of, how do we make sure that the AIs are under human control? And you did say a bit about that today. And the other is just the idea of AI alignment, which often gets framed as aligned with human values. Yeah. And maybe I thought you'd just invite you to say a little bit, that I know you said more in your manuscript about that.
Yeah. So one thing that one can say is, well, which values? How would we know what values to align them with? We have all kinds of values. Humans are creatures that are capable of aggression and vengefulness. We have egoistic as well as altruistic values. Humans have a huge range of values. And we can't assume that these are the best values for individuals to have if they're going to make the best use of their lives that they have on this earth. And so I would first say that insofar as we're thinking of alignment, we should be thinking of alignment not with human values, but with ethical values. And that would help us as humans. Most of the fears that we have are about unethical behavior, in effect, in AI agents. And it would also mean that they have the same standing in the value system that we would have, because these would not be specifically human values tied to our particular interests or tied to our human nature or our sentiments. They would be values that are important for them as well. And so, and for achieving their purposes as well. And so I would say alignment would be with something like ethical values. And I think the way to think about that is the way that we think about, for example, how large-scale learning gets systems to align with linguistic usage, or it gets it to align with our understanding of causal relations. I think there is a very complex web of understandings, social understandings, causal understandings, psychological understandings, which underwrite our capacity to get along with one another in ways that are mutually productive. And I don't think we can, as you say, it's a system. It's not just one value or just one norm. And it may not be that what needs to be at the bottom of it is something like distinctively moral value. I suspect not. It would be something that what we philosophers call non-moral value, goods that are good independently of whether they're morally good or not. So it would be goods like that that would be at the bottom. But those will tend to be goods for these systems as well. I mean, one way an economist thinks about goods is, well, what are the goals of the agent? And we'll say what's good is realizing those goals. And so that will count as a kind of good for that agent. And if we can understand that, then we can understand, yeah, that's right, they can have goods, they can have benefits and harms, their situations can be improved or weakened. They can look to one another in order to find assets, resources that they need. They're all going to depend upon a huge underlying system of coordination for the generation of power, the generation of information, the sharing of information. They won't be able to do all this on their own. And they wouldn't want to, because if you look at the societies that are most effective at problem solving, they're not societies with one value scheme that dominates and one form of social order that dominates. These are largely pluralistic societies, and pluralism is essential to the kind of innovation. And so if they can look far enough ahead, and humans are beginning to figure that out, they realize that, I see, yeah, actually diversified societies with relatively egalitarian norms do a better job of social problem solving and making possible individual lives within social frameworks than authoritarian societies.
But I'm wondering so I'm totally with you that norms, ethics are solving collective action problem. They're solving our cooperation problem, our group problem. And so there's, this focus on the functionality of that. But when you say, well, we should align not with human values, if I think I heard you, but rather with ethical values, and then say, well, those are functional purposes. So what's the path to that? And I'm a bit worried about the answer that you may be giving. The path to that could be this kind of functional reasoning. Right? I can reason my way. I'm an AI agent. I can reason my way to what would be the value that would solve a cooperation problem. Which I do actually think a lot of people working in AI alignment have the idea that, oh, well, they're going to be fantastic reasoners.
Yep.
So they'll figure out what the optimal solution is. And this makes me very nervous. As opposed to, while I do think that human societies are working their way to, whether it's through group selection or through deliberate effort, collective reasoning, to better solutions to our collective action problems, I'd worry about AI agents that were doing that reasoning, that calculation to align versus saying, okay, what is this group doing? How is this group currently? Which I think sounds like aligning with human values, or at least with human institutions, the values reflected in existing human institutions. I would call that the equilibrium.
Yeah, good. So it's certainly true that AI agents will want to know what norms we have. And it'll turn out that those are varied norms, and their interactions with us will be mediated in part by their understanding of the norms that we have. On the other hand, they should not assume in advance, just as we should not assume in advance, that the norms are the best norms to have. They need some standpoint from which they can be critical of norms. And I'll just give you a simple example. So right now we have these chat bots. And they're based, as people say, they're based on LLMs. And, well, really, they're based on LLMs plus a question answering agent. So there's an agent there. And that agent was trained by human feedback, proffering answers based on the information in the LLM and having those answers judged well or ill by the human responders. Now, one thing that they seem to have learned is norms of discourse from this. Relevant information, if the individual is unsatisfied with the answers, if you've probably done this yourself, that's actually not the right answer, that's not a good answer, they know how to go back and respond. Is that the right answer? Reflect on that. But these aren't reasoning processes. These are processes that have been shaped by reinforcement learning and by interaction. And so one thing I would say is for them to learn these kinds of ways of interacting, they will need to be more genuinely interactive. With humans, sure, but with one another. And when they interact with one another, they can't just assume human interests. They'll need to figure out, well, what's that agent interested in? And so if we want them to have grounded capacities here, that will come from the fact that they engage in these kinds of interactions, which can be successful or unsuccessful relative to the purposes involved. And so, and that's how humans did it.
Right. I'm going to open it up to comments, questions from the audience. And I'll leave it to whoever's moving our mics around to select people. But do make sure you're moving around the room and to the front as well. And while we're getting that, maybe I'll just ask you one last question before we launch in. The MIT Media Lab did a project with the trolley problem, as I'm sure you know, where they collected lots of data.
Yeah.
With the idea that, well, you train the model on that data. What do you think of that exercise?
Well, that's interesting because it'd be useful for AI agents to know how we think about trolley problems, but that, I don't think is the way to develop ethical competency in them.
Okay.
They will develop ethical competency, I think, and they can do that from interactions and from the ways in which they will find that they do depend upon one another. And then it will be a part of their DNA, so to speak. It won't just be a bunch of imported judgments. So one thing I'm not is a fan of the idea that it's their reasoning power that will make AI agents capable in this way. I think it will be their complex, intuitive understanding.
Right. Okay.
Hello, I'm Lev McGinney. I really appreciated your talk. I have, I'm over here.
Got it.
I'll stand up. I have one sort of comment on the discourse here. Back in October, Jeffrey Hinton gave a talk, and I think the core premise of his talk was making this distinction between digital entities and biological entities. So we're not, actually I won't say biological, because in some sense biology is also digital, but learning systems that need to develop and learning systems that you can just copy and paste perfectly and copy and paste all of their knowledge. I think that this might prove to be a kind of a challenge to the premise that you will have agents with diverse goals. Because when you have digital agents, you can just run checksums on them to make sure they're exactly the same as you. You don't necessarily need to collaborate with them, you just need to replicate. Like cells in your own body, they don't talk to each other so much as they are literally all the same thing. This opens like a lot of avenues for collaboration that are not possible for entities like ourselves that develop and have more diversity. A T cell can look at another cell and be like, oh, you've mutated too much, and just kill it, and then replicate a new cell. Same with an ant colony. It can make sure that all of its ants are, roughly genetically similar and therefore all going to collaborate with each other. And I think that's very possible for AI systems as well. If I'm not entirely sure if we should even consider all the different entities. Like, for example, if I spin up a new ChatGPT instance, is that really a new agent? Or is that just another instantiation of the same agent? Because
I'm
in
going
some
to
sense-
ask you to get to
Yeah.
a question just because the room is full of hands up and I want to get as many as we can. So I'll encourage everybody let's get to a question. Thanks.
Okay. So I think my core question is, does this pose a problem for the premise that we're going to have diverse goals?
Good, yeah, thanks. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that there are biological ways of getting something like the same effect as the digital effect, which is when you have agents that reproduce by cloning. And there'll be glitches in that, but there'll be glitches in electronic computers as well. I guess I would, it's always not, it's probably a big mistake to try to disagree with Jeffrey Hinton, but the fact that these are copies of one another does not eliminate conflict of interest among them. Because every bit of energy that one of them gets, another one doesn't get. There's a finite amount of energy available. This is true within the human body as well. It isn't that all of our cells have the same goal. We often have to destroy our own cells. Our cells are all drawing from a similar pool of energy. They are all active in an exchange economy with different purposes. And so if you look at the cell model, you'll see actually there are tremendous variety of purposes of cells. Often there are conflicts among them, and they're able to cooperate together because we were selected to have that diversity of cell types. But that isn't a case where each agent, so to speak, has the same interest in that they cooperate because they have the same interest. They could have the same interest and still not cooperate because they're competing for scarce resources.
Great. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the talk.
Maybe stand up.
Sure.
Everybody can
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you. This is mainly directed at Peter Railton, but I'm interested in hearing either of your perspectives. There's at least two traditions in ethics that take intentions or motivations on the part of a moral agent to be a key feature of when we give moral evaluation, right? The shopkeeper who returns your change out of a sense of duty is morally different than the shopkeeper who returns the exact same amount of change out of some botched attempt to scam you, right? These are and where the functional description of those two cases might be identical. And so I'm interested in using real sort of moral ethical terms, not just sort of functional or normative descriptive terms. And I'm wondering to what extent discussion of intentions or motivations on the part of AI agents needs to enter the discussion and the degree to which such talk is possible. Maybe some of your discussion of goals there touched on it a bit, but I mean, yeah, so how much ought we incorporate discussion of intentions, and to what degree is that even sort of a sensible thing to incorporate? So thank you.
It is a sensible thing to say, and part of why I was using the examples I did from human judgment is it's obviously very important how we assess the motivations and intentions of those around us. That's an important part of ethics. And so even if the behavior is the same, a baby looking at adult interactions, this is actually something that can be done. Baby looking at adult interactions, if they see an adult favoring one child over another, not themselves, neither one is themselves, then even if that adult has favored them in the past, they trust that adult less because they recognize that that adult isn't operating on a principle of equitable treatment. And so as soon as that adult changes their interests, they might be the one who gets frozen out. And so yes, they're modeling each other as agents. Infants are modeling us as agents and each other. And that's very important. So the motivational structure, the intentionality is extremely important. Now, the shopkeeper example, which I guess is Kant's, part of what that example is used, though, is to distinguish what he calls the theory of right and the theory of virtue. Is it right for the shopkeeper to return correct change? Yes. Is it wrong for him to do it if he does it out of selfish motivation? No, it's not wrong. It's still the right thing for the agent to do. Is it virtuous if he does it out of selfish motivation? No. And so what Kant wants to say is there's the domain of ethics, which is concerned with the doctrine of right, and that's the domain which is essentially, for example, the social contract domain, where it's not so important whether these are virtuous agents, so long as their interests are aligned in certain ways that they behave together, in a fashion that does not lead to certain conflicts and competitions and so on. That's sufficient. And that part of ethics, which is a big part of ethics and a big part of safety that we have with one another, that part, if it depends on interests, if it depends upon virtuous motivation, if it's robust enough, it will do its job. And so that's the sense in which Kant says, yes, the doctrine of right is not the same as the doctrine of virtue. We want people to do the right action. We don't want people just to do something from moral virtue, because from moral virtue, they might perform wrong actions. Well, how do we know what the right actions are? Well, for Kant, it's what kind of a maxim could be generalized. That's not a claim about anybody's intention as such. It's a claim about whether people could live under this system in a fashion that didn't result in certain types of contradictions. And that's essentially this picture, the ethical picture of a system of cooperation. But there's a big part of morality that isn't just the ethics of interpersonal relations. Personal morality, virtue, and so on, those are all very important. And I didn't say much about those, but I think it will be quite important that AI agents develop what we would think of as virtuous characteristics, like trustworthiness and forms of reciprocity and loyalty.
I think this question is bringing out for me the danger side of saying that this is how we build ethically competent or normatively competent AI agents, that it's grounded very much in sort of what you were just describing as, here's our theory of ethics, here's what Kant has to say, here's where we think it, and sort of from an internal perspective, saying here's what the shopkeeper should do, and we resolve that question. So if I think about, thinking about normative systems, I say, well, there's an equilibrium in societies that groups of humans have settled into differentially in different places. And there probably is a way that society, if it's a Western society, it may very well be settled on like a Kantian approach, but we don't know that that's true universally everywhere for all time. And that I do worry about the idea that and I think this is the way we've been sort of approaching this in AI ethics and alignment, safety work, is the idea, well, we'll solve what the problem is of that internal question, rather than what does this community do with this question? No, maybe it's just something we can explore a little bit more.
We should take another.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I just had a quick question about trust. So if we consider that in the case of the trolley problem, we try to maximize the trustworthiness. But in the case of the roommates saying that they didn't pull the trigger because they couldn't do it, do we compare the difference in trust by putting the switch against a baseline of indifference? And do we only save lives because doing so would maximize trust? And then following up on this, if we consider a statement which could cause untrust and purely maximizing trustworthiness as our objective, there could be an incentive to lie in order to maximize trust. Do humans perhaps only not lie as doing so would cause a decrease in trust if found out? And how would that translate to AI?
Let me see if I've understood that. You mean if we focused on something like maximizing trust, that could have a perverse effect of undermining trust? Yeah, good. Yeah, and I didn't mean to be saying that we understand these trolley problems in terms of taking the action which maximizes trust. I was trying to explain the response in terms of, well, what's the right or the wrong action to take? And I was using trust as a probe to try to get at what are the internal models that seem to be driving this pattern of judgments. Trust is a very broad, very general one. It's going to be extremely important for social interaction. It's important for language. It's important for knowledge. It's important for many forms of social coordination that have nothing to do with ethics. And so trust is quite important. That's why I think it's a good probe. But the idea is not that we're maximizing trustworthiness. And I agree with you that if you just had that picture, then it's not clear that people would be as reliable or trustworthy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. This has been a fascinating conversation so far. My name is Joseph Wilson, and I'm an anthropologist. And I have a question a bit about accountability. So one of the questions that I've been grappling with around kind of framing AI agents as part of these kind of normative ethical systems is what happens when we need to hold them account for their behavior. And of course, I think that's true at a kind of macro level, like who do we sue if a self-driving car hits somebody or makes a trolley decision problem on its own, at a kind of infrastructure level, right? And part of that is that these agents are not kind of natural parts of our environment, but are kind of presented to us from the forces of capital from Silicon Valley. But also at a micro level too, right? Those tiny social nudges that happen when people violate norms, things like shame or ostracization or even loneliness. These are bodily sensations that people feel. And when we do that, we know that there is a human body on the other end that is receiving our nudges. So what happens when we are trying to nudge AI back into a normative frame, but there's no human body there, or there's no human mind there to react in a way we would expect?
Right, good. Yeah, so, boy, there are a lot of questions involved in there, and I won't begin to discuss all of them. So let me give you an example and see if this is helpful. Go back to the question of trust, and one reflection of the question of trust is reputation. Having a reputation is a very important, a good reputation is a very important thing for an agent. And how you can gain or lose reputation is going to be a big driver of interpersonal interaction and what reputation you acquire. And so if you think that, one way in which AI agents are being held accountable is by their reputations. And if an AI agent exists because it's paid for and adopted, AI agents that are not reliable, that have bad reputations, will pay the price for that failure. So there are things like punishment and benefit for AI agents. And you might even think, well, why couldn't law treat them as agents as well? Suppose an autonomous AI system has done a very good job of being reliable in the past, and another AI system, for strategic reasons, is trying to circulate false information about that. It seems like that's a harm to the initial agent. It seems like the initial agent would have some kind of standing to complain about that harm. One way in which agents can be penalized is, you don't get as many computes as you had before if you behave this way. So, you could imagine a dialogue or a dialectic, really, of punishment and reward existing with regard to AI agents. Once we appreciate that they will have goals, they will have things that matter to them, and we can either benefit or harm those goals. And that's a kind of holding accountable. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in on I think this is thinking about the legal infrastructure to say that this is, again, sort of emphasizing that our complex coordination and interaction as humans takes a lot of institutional infrastructure to implement, and that I absolutely do think we're going to need to have a form of legal personhood, meaning that recognition as having standing in a system of dispute resolution, and an identity. I think the only way you have reputation is if you have a durable entity that has a bank account, has assets, has something to lose from being cut off from future interactions or being required to compensate for harms.
Go
ahead.
One way to think about this, again, is that we have already created artificial agents that have standing. Corporations, associations,
exactly.
trusts, and so on. And that's not just because the individuals within them have standing. In fact, the individual won't have the standing of the trust or the corporation. And the corporation will be more durable, it will have a different identity, it will have different interests, and it can be sued or sue on the basis of those interests.
Right.
So this is a kind of legal recognition of an agent. And it doesn't require that the corporation be conscious. It doesn't require that the corporation has a sense of shame. It does require that there are incentives and disincentives for corporations. And the law can do that very well with fines and penalties of various kinds.
Exactly, yes, for sure. Okay, we've got Glenn.
That was a characteristically erudite talk, Professor Railton. I guess I wanted to ask a question about whether, on your view, AI agents are fit subjects for Straussonian reactive attitudes like resentment, and whether it matters for the account. So let me just play this out for a second, which is to say, I was struck with the hypotheticals you give to your students regarding roommates and how their families would feel about this. That's kind of begging for a particular kind of reactive attitude. Yeah. And in a system where some of the players like us both are subjects to those reactive attitudes, but also hold those reactive attitudes, but the other parties to the interaction, the AI agents, may have neither, whether that changes in terms of the modeling.
Yeah, good. So are people familiar with the language of reactive attitudes?
You should give us a little.
Sorry?
I think you should give us a little intro.
Just a quick little introduction. So I guess this originally started with P.F. Strawson. And originally he was thinking about things like the free will problem. And you might say, well, you have to resolve the metaphysical question of determinism versus indeterminism. You can say, well, no, actually, what we do is we hold each other responsible, we hold ourselves responsible, and we have various attitudes that are keyed to that, like resentment, if someone behaves in a way that's detrimental to us for no good reason. And so the idea was you could actually construct a system of evaluation on the basis of these complex reactive attitudes towards agents without trying to solve the metaphysical question. And the idea would be that, well, we are in place with these attitudes. This is what the attitudes do. What about reactive attitudes toward AI systems? Well, there's a whole range of reactive attitudes. Resentment, for example, a sense of being insulted. Some of these reactive attitudes go more to the question of what kind of attitude exists on the part of the agent who performed the action. So insult works something like this. If I discover that something's an honest mistake on your part, I don't blame you for it in the same way that if I learned that it was because you wanted to harm me for saying the thing that you did. And for me to be insulted by it, it's important that I see it not just as a mistake on your part, but something that had intentionality behind it. So insofar as artificial agents will have things like intentions, then there will be questions of what's intentional and what's accidental on their part. And we could have attitudes of accountability that are keyed to those intentionality differences. Would they have the same coloration as human reactive attitudes? We don't expect these systems, at least not as they are now construed, to have the phenomenology of guilt or the phenomenology of shame. And we might think that it would be foolish for us to have the same range of reactive attitudes in response to them. But whether they would be entitled to reactive attitudes on their part based on the intentionality that humans showed to them, and whether we would be entitled to some reactive attitudes on our part based on the intentionality they showed to us, that would still be in place.
Can I just offer another way of thinking about the reactive attitudes? Again, I want to move sort of from that internal perspective on human systems to sort of like how do I think about this from the point of view of third-party enforcement? So I would think that the attitudes of resentment, the attitudes of insult are tied to the imposition of a cost on someone who has violated a rule of some kind. And that they are part of that mechanism, that if I'm anticipating resentment, if I'm anticipating insult, or if I'm experiencing it, right? That I'm computing that into what will be the consequences of taking this action, part of that system. So what may be important for AI systems is that they can participate in both the giving and the receiving of consequences, punishment for rule violations, but that it could be a different kind of mechanism.
Well, yeah, psychologically, and the kinds of punishment may differ in some ways, but many of them will still be the same, like withdrawal of cooperation, for example.
Yeah, and we may care about intentions because that's our way of predicting. Oh, if you behave like that, then I can predict in the future you're going to behave in the following ways, and so I'm going to make a decision today, for example, about withdrawing cooperation. Great. Okay, where's our next? I also want to make sure we get some women asking questions. So can I say to my handers out of microphones, please be sure you're not missing any women's hands going. But please, go ahead.
One of the things we're trying to get at here is we have to program into AI systems, which is what Asimov tried to do, as opposed to
Yeah.
or can they learn on their own? And the emphasis here is on learning artificial agents learning on their own to learn ethical or strategic behavior.
Yeah.
But the starting point of all that literature or that analysis is that the agent has, well, self-interest goals. The most basic goal of all individuals is what? Self-preservation. Right? We can't get that self-preservation in there, we've got a problem. But more crucially is starting the crucial feature for self-preservation is the notion of the self. Can AI systems develop a notion of self so they can pursue that goal of self-preservation? All I've seen so far in the AI systems, AI agents, is that they don't have a sense of the self. The closest I've seen is the early days of computers. Computers learned how to play chess and win in chess by dividing themselves in this computer to play against themselves and other doing at times. That's the closest I've seen to development of a notion of a self. How are we going beyond that?
Good, yeah, and this is a very elusive set of questions because it's not clear what it is we're after when we talk about ourselves. This is kind of Hume's point that in some ways the self is not a present part of a factorable part of the experience. So one way to think about a self is as a causal locus. A locus of possible behaviors, a locus of goals, a locus of information. And AI agents can indeed have representations of that locus and how it's different from your locus, and how, therefore, this one can be expected to behave differently from that one. And, sorry, I don't mean to.
That's all right, I got it.
And that's, as I say, that may be enough of a sense of self to get the ethics going. It's not the same sense of self that morality in its fullest form deals with. It is a representation, it's a model of the self. It's a model that has many of the features of a self in terms of being an organizing location for behavior, for benefits and harms. But does it have an identity in the same sense that you or I might have an identity? Well, in one sense, yes, it's got a numerical identity. This one versus that one. Does it have an identity in the sense that we fancy ourselves to have identities, which is thought to be a deeper thing? And you're right, there's no reason yet to think that AI agents have that. But again, what AI agents enable us to do is to try to take categories in psychology and see how we could realize them in a system that is transparent to us, unlike the brain and the self. We can be surprised at how far we can get. And so I have a certain style of talking and acting and thinking because of my particular upbringing. The same is true with large language models. based on what they have learned, they will have a particular style, a particular set of ways of doing things, particular associations, and so they will also have, in some sense, personality, because they will be dependent upon a particular history in the same way that I have a personality because of a dependency upon a particular history. So they can have the idea of a causal locus and the idea of a distinctive personality or style, and you might say, well, that's 2/3 of the way toward a notion of self.
Hi, I have a question about this. So there's this fancy term, multimodality, which is basically sound, vision, all of that. And something you said about the color range of reactive attitudes, attitudes. That sort of reminded me of like this notion of synesthesia, which is kind of like seeing, I think, color from music, if I'm not mistaken. And I wonder, because you mentioned the self as well, and how there are different sides to the self, and also just you see, the side of you that's in this conference right now, maybe a little nervous, to maybe if you're at home, you're a lot more confident. And I think to myself about the self, which is, I feel like it's very decentralized. Like we have different strands towards different communities, and that sort of, I wonder about that connection, like incorporating more depth to how we consider things like norms and ethical values beyond just binary things, if that makes sense.
So one thing you might be interested in is not just judgments of, let's say, right, wrong, but of degrees of goodness, let's say, of behavior, is that?
Yeah, I guess just more, I can't really think of the word right now, but I think about like, because AI agents don't really have eyes, so they don't see more of reality than we do. So that's...
Yeah. So one of the thoughts, there's this problem with existing question answering agents based on LLMs that they are guilty of fabricating. And if you ask, well, what kinds of things, in a way you could say, well, how could they not fabricate? They've been given this huge body of data, which is their only world, and that body of data is full of various kinds of conflicting information. And if you're trying to triangulate on the basis of conflicting information, you may get to something that's fabricated. That's how associative systems work. Well, how could you get them to be more grounded? Well, one proposal here is that by having them not just learn from texts, but to learn in multimodal ways with vision as well as texts, that can help with grounding their understanding of causation, for example, maybe increasing their understanding of social relations. Another way of grounding them is to have them function in connection with some kind of motor control task. So they learn something more about causation, about time sequence, and so on. They get more of the structure of the world. And so you could think that the basic engine of learning is that it's inheriting structure from the world. And insofar as you got the structure wrong, you'll get an incongruity, and then that incongruity can be used to revise the representation and maybe have less incongruity going forward. And so you think, for these systems to have adequate representation of the structure of the world, they would need to interact with the world in the various modalities that are possible. And that is definitely something that's being explored. And one of these modalities is social. That is, apparently you can increase, this is fairly recent work, apparently you can increase the accuracy of answers that are given if you have two models, both contributing information and working out between them an answer. And so we have the social modality, of understanding, and it looks like for them a social modality can be important as well.
I think there was another person right behind there.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I want to go practical, thinking for decision makers, for regulators. We're there, we listen to we understand that the survival of these agents will be based on their collaboration. We understand that because they're going to look for their own survival. They're not thinking about humans. They're not working towards human benefit. So I'm thinking, how do we conduct or guide this development of an ethical sense? And would it be, for example, incentivizing, strengthening the collaboration between certain types of models, certain types of AIs that are, in their essence, is human well-being, human protection and development. For example, I'm thinking, what do we do with the vehicle, with AI, autonomous, thank you, autonomous vehicles.
Right.
Do we connect them, for example? I'm thinking to work together and develop a same sense of human protection. For example, I'm thinking with an AI, health AI, from, I don't know, support from emergency room kind of AI, something that has human at their core. Do you think that could help? Because if not, I'm thinking, what do? We just wait and see what happens, like you said, and just hope?
Let me take that as your question there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let me see if I've got that. No, we don't sit back and hope any more than we would with a human infant. We create structured environments in which they can, through their own learning, understand the importance of various kinds of values and various kinds of practices that are part of this ethical landscape. And so, yeah, we need to have active interaction. They need to have active interaction with one another. They need to be trying to solve problems and solve problems that require one another to solve them. We need to have our role in giving them whatever feedback we do. We shouldn't expect that they will always prioritize human interests. And you might say, well, that might not be a bad thing. Some human interests should not be prioritized. If you have a system which just takes the interests that humans give it and give those priority, then that's a great way to build a system that's incredibly destructive. And if instead you're cultivating values that are more general and that have to deal with counting interests more equally, then that's a better safeguard, really, because if you just have them always prioritize the relevant human interests, it's not going to be for the best. So an example of this would be self-driving cars. If each car, you could get into your car and say, I want you to get to that destination as fast as you possibly can. I don't care what you have to do. Okay? And if every person gets into their car and says, I want you to get to the destination as fast as you can, I don't care what you do, you're just going to get a big traffic jam. And that's because if cars won't, the other day I was on a panel with a research head at Microsoft, and he said, the head of his autonomous vehicles came to him and said, look, we're making great progress, but we have one huge unsolved problem. He said, what's that? And he said, merging. And I'm sure sat in traffic jams which persist precisely because individuals are insisting, I'm going to get there as fast as I can. I don't care what I have to do that. If they can defer to one another, they can merge smoothly, even and clear these intersections. So if the autonomous vehicle just takes its direction from the human who's in the vehicle, then it won't have the right responses in these kinds of social situations. Is that?
All right, I think that's actually, let's see, I think we've just got about 3 minutes left. Kelly, I assume you have a few things to say before we break, so I think we're gonna call it there. We have a chance to, thanks so much, Peter, that was
Thank you for
really
your questions.
terrific.